Welcome back to Watching the Contrarians, where I'm joined by Julian Lisa, Greg O'Mahony and Peter Bentley. We've been discussing the budget. A whole bunch of tweets have been coming in, accusations of liberal bias. I was accused, I think, Greg, by one of the tweets of defending the Kroger-Costello situation. No one's defending it. It's a debacle. It's just the point is that neither of them is an MP. They're a bunch of has-beens, or perhaps never was, if you want to be unkind. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the equivalent of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating having a stoush if neither had ever made it to be Prime Minister.
Well, if that was a defence, I'd hate to see you attack them. But I think it's a bit harsh calling Costello a never has-been. He was a federal treasurer for a long time. I think that's a little bit tough.
Well, no, that was actually about...
never made PM, but...
yeah, well, that was about Kroger in the sense that he never went into politics, in the same way that we are all never has been. So I guess, in fairness, we've had a tweet come in as well from a motorcycle lover clearly looking at his picture, but he says, but using the... This is in relation to my argument that the way that the economy is being driven by the Labor Party at the moment is a little bit like driving a car by both using the brake and the throttle at the same time. That's the levers that they think that they're pulling. But using the rear brake and throttle is a textbook way of cornering a motorcycle. Wayne Swan is a motorcycle kind of guy. Julian, you're a motorcycle kind of guy, aren't you? Often see you take the levers off out the front here and in you come.
I'm not really sure what a motorcycle kind of guy means, Peter. I'm not really sure that you consider Wayne Swan as any kind of high-powered kind of guy, and a motorcycle, I suppose, is quite high-powered.
I think Wayne Swan is a motorcycle type of guy in that he's had the Reserve Bank...
He's a biker, you reckon? He's
had the Reserve Bank... move and cut interest rates before the budget. I think the Reserve Bank will seriously
Swan can take credit for that?
No, he can't take credit, but the fact that the budget was going to come into surplus, the fact that it will be now...
Not the $44 billion one, the one
No, the 1.5 and the 1.5... No, that's right, the 1.5, and we know that later this year, if budget conditions change, then he will make more cuts.
With one possible exception, Julian.
Can I just say, if Wayne Swan is a motorcycle kind of guy, he's like one of the two fat ladies. He's the fat lady that's being driven round in the sidecar at the moment. Because on the 1.5% billion
what's the sidecar
surplus,
called?
It's called a sidecar.
Pill passenger or something.
I mean, when you think about the 1.5 billion surplus, if it was real, why has he asked for a 50 billion increase on the government borrowing limit? If the surplus was real, he wouldn't need that. But he's asked for the 50 billion.
Well, the answer's easy, Julian. It's because he needs the extra 50 billion bucks.
He needs 50 billion bucks.
He knows he's going to go into deficit.
The surplus isn't real. That's exactly the point.
I think the main point isn't about the surplus. We probably won't get there whether we do or not. It's just a number. I think the big issue is we've been misled. We've been told for months it was going to be an incredibly tough budget. Peter, you've just explained it in an even more bizarre way than the Treasurer and the Prime Minister. You've said in response to it not being a tough budget, you said, well, hold on, it's cut back on foreign aid. If you regard that as a tough budget, if the threshold for a tough budget is, well, we've taken a little bit of money, a very small sum of money from overseas aid, and we're actually deploying it locally, that is just the most extraordinary definition of a tough budget.
No, that's what you said. The point I'm making, Greg, is this. We're watching Europe and America go through some pretty tough austerity measures, and we all know we're not out of
a tough time. What do you reckon?
No, absolutely, and we all know that the Australian economy isn't out of the woods yet, and what we've seen is a budget that's put more funds into our domestic economy, and if things do get tough, it's put more funds into working families, and if things do get tough, then this will hopefully provide a boost. Now, I
if
think
the tough budget is one that
allowed...
increases spending, what's a relaxed budget?
Well, we know that there have been cuts, and Peter's rightly pointed out that this is a forecast for a surplus, but I think, and the Treasurer has made the point himself when he was asked post his budget speech, will he make more cuts to deliver a surplus, and he said he will.
This is a serious question.
Yeah.
A Labor Treasurer delivers a budget. He removes the increases to foreign aid, the guy that he can't stand, Kevin Rudd, was advocating. He cuts defence. Let's be honest. The Defence Force aren't what you'd call huge fans of the Defence Minister, Stephen Smith. He increases taxes on super for high-income earners, and he gets rid of the plans to cut the company tax cut. Again, companies not being Labor's core constituency. And then he massively injects funds to lower and middle income earners. What's the part of this budget that for a Labor Treasurer is tough?
Well, I think the part that's tough is coming back to surplus, and there have been major cuts. No, there have been major significant cuts.
I outlined just then the way he does it.
Yeah, and
so
a lot
slug
of
the
those
rich,
cuts are tough.
give money to the poor, other than the real poor in the third world, where you don't give the promised increases to foreign aid that the guy...
Peter, a lot of those cuts are tough, and there's a lot that many of us don't agree with, and I agree with you. Some of the super cuts I don't agree with. I think they shouldn't have been made. But the fact of the matter is, we are, according to these forecasts, going back to surplus, but at the same time, there are working people that are doing it very tough with cost of living pressures are going to get some relief. And this is the point that the Treasurer has been making about redistributing the benefits of the mining boom. He tried to provide a company tax cut. The Greens and the opposition refused to support that. And as Keane said, you know, when circumstances change, I change my position. What do you do? So what did we expect him to do?
They either believe in the company tax cut or they don't, and they should have continued to prosecute it. I mean, there was legislation
but how, Julian?
During the Howard government we couldn't get through the Senate.
Parliament, and if it doesn't get through, then it doesn't get through.
And you hold it there. You can use it as a double dissolution trigger, if you like, at some point.
Yeah, because that's what this government wants. They want an election.
I'd be delighted if they had
a double dissolution figure is the only way you guarantee that they get wiped out.
You know, the broader point here is that people don't have a lot of confidence at the moment, and part of the lack of confidence in the economy is because of the unpredictability of government decision making. People want certainty. And if the government says you're going to have a company tax cut, the government should have stuck with the company tax cut.
But Julian, this is the Parliament. This is the Parliament we're talking about.
Well,
and the
just
Greens
because they can't
and the
get
Liberal
things through the
Party
Parliament doesn't mean that they should dump them.
But what should they do?
Well, people ask if they just dump things, what do they stand for? It's a bit like the ETS. Remember, Kevin Rudd told us it was the great moral challenge of our time. He dumped it. It was a bit like Julia Gillard. She told us we'd never have a carbon tax.
The Malaysian solution hasn't been taken to Parliament.
Well,
the company tax cuts won't go to Parliament. The pokies deal that Julia Gillard broke and stabbed Andrew Wilkie in the back over wasn't taken to Parliament. I actually think it's a political blunder. Forget what you think about whether they'd get it through. It's a political blunder. They're trying to make the message that Tony Abbott is Mr. No or Dr. No. They would get that message through if they took things to Parliament and he kept rejecting them. But when they say, oh, it's all too hard, we're not going to take it to Parliament because we know he'll reject it, then that's just ridiculous.
It shows they don't have the courage of the conviction.
I think this government is genuinely scared of prosecuting a policy, of trying to explain the value of the policy. Well, you would be too if you're as bad at communicating as they are. Well, you said at the outset of this show about the gay marriage issue and Gillard's dragging the heels on that and potentially publicly having a very different view to what she has privately. I think that's just a great example of she would not back herself and she wouldn't back this government to sell that policy to parts of the constituency that struggle with it. And it's across the board. And that's why so many policies are being abandoned on the footsteps of Parliament.
One thing's really interesting. I mean, if you look at Howard in his post-prime ministerial life, he hasn't said, oh, if only we did this, if only we did that. I reckon a lot of the Labor front bench in their post-ministerial life will say, oh, I wish we'd done this, I wish we'd done that. But they weren't actually able to stay with it.
I agree with you.
And I just think people need to demonstrate the courage of their convictions. And that's what's the difference between the two parties.
You've got to have convictions to have the courage of them, Julian, be fair.
That's right.
A tweet that's come in from a fellow called Listen Sport. I want to help him out. He said, retweet if PVO should join Chris Uhlmann, that's Chris Uhlmann who's married to a Labor MP, by the way, by being given the boot for liberal bias. He wants that retweeted. I thought I'd help you out, Listen Sport, because you've got 29 followers, so you kind of need the exposure if you want to get that one retweeted. Greg, let's move back into the space of the budget, but let's look at Tony Abbott's reply speech. Now, the expectation usually is that a budget reply speech might contain just a fabric of detail here or there. Tony Abbott had none. Motherhood statements galore. What was your view of it?
Well, the outline of the speech at the beginning was, we have a vision. There's an alternative course, there's a better course, and there's a better path. If you actually looked at, in a concrete way, what he fleshed out as being part of that path, it was one initiative designed to increase spending on the teaching of languages, foreign languages, particularly Asian languages. It was not what you'd say it was a detailed, written reply. Having said that, parts of it I thought were pretty rhetorically charged. The way he accused the government of being absolutely petrified about the imposition of the carbon tax and that being behind so much of what was announced in the budget, I think is true. It's pretty hard to argue with. This government is as is Oakeshott. We've seen Oakeshott in the last few days come out and say that the floor on the carbon price might have to be reconsidered. Now, they're the words of a man who's pretty worried about his getting re-elected for his seat, and also potentially pretty worried about...
he shouldn't really worry about getting re-elected. He's got no chance. Start looking for a job.
No, but don't you think that's a dramatic thing? He was in the room when the carbon tax was negotiated. He was like front and centre. He said a very big part of why he imposed this government was was for that issue. And for him to start saying, well, it might have to be revisited. Wayne Swan came very close the other night to saying, well, there's a big spread between the carbon price in Australia that's going to be imposed and what's in Europe. It might have to be looked at. And this government is scared of one thing at the moment, and huge parts of the budget were dedicated to that.
I think it was a very effective budget reply speech. I think it was a good speech, and I actually think the one piece of policy that was in there, I support the Asian language initiative. I think it's a good initiative, but the problem is, and I've never been on this bandwagon that opposition leaders have to outline a detailed economic plan. They're in opposition, and that's fine, but the two things that we have here is, one, Tony Abbott wants to be Prime Minister now. He's constantly calling for an election and saying he's ready to govern. So for someone that's saying that, you would think he'd be putting a bit of meat on the bone, a few policy initiatives, a few outlines, as opposed to just one. And the second point is, there are genuine concerns out there in the business community and in the community more broadly about Tony Abbott's economic management. Now, this is a budget reply speech, and once again, he could have put some meat on the bone, talked about his economic plans, but he didn't. He had a very politically charged and very effective speech, but didn't actually put any details out there.
All right, hold that thought. We are going to take a commercial break. When we come back, class warfare, North Shore snobs. Julian lives on the North Shore. We're going to discuss these issues in a moment. You're watching Contrarians. We're going to move on now, gentlemen, to discuss class war. Julia Gillard has decided to tee off that Tony Abbott has been out of touch because he lives on the North Shore. Julian, Lisa, you're a North Shore dweller, just like Mr. Abbott. What's your view? Is he out of touch? Well, that's right. My producer doesn't accept that you're on the North Shore because he's sort of an elite on the inner North Shore, and you're somewhere further out.
I live in Northern Sydney, in Pennant Hills, Peter. So I just think what Gillard's done this week was tragic. I think this class warfare stuff demonstrates that she's jumped the shark. This is the same sort of tactic that Keneally and Bligh adopted. You had today at lunch, when Tony Abbott was making his speech at the Millennium Forum, Tony quoting Troy Bramston and Troy's article about how Labor leaders in the past...
you got sent the same talking note that the opposition leader's office tried to send to me.
I heard it. How
the quote from Troy Bramston.
How Labor leaders in the past wanted to unite the country, not divide it. And, what have you got from Julia Gillard?
I got the same talking note, Julian. The difference is I didn't just run their line.
Weird class warfare. And I think it demonstrates how far out of touch with reality Gillard is. And if anyone could have left themselves open to a personal attack, it's her.
Greg O'Mahony? Hang on. Whoa. Why, if anyone could have left themselves open to a personal attack, it's her?
Well, the idea that she's somehow in touch with reality in a way that Tony Abbott's not, just is not fair.
I think I agree with you, but why?
Well, I think if you agree with me, you don't need me to explain
you're
why.
You're not going to go through it. All right. Greg O'Mahony.
I feel like you guys are playing cryptic crosswords. But no, I just think the choice of language is unfortunate. But there is an inequality of wealth problem in Australia, and there's no doubt about that. And there are certain policies in Australia that do need to be addressed. And you can't justify welfare to the super wealthy in the context of a country where parts of which have youth unemployment of 30 or 40%. I think the language that she's used is unfortunate, but the actual policy direction of trying to address serious inequality of wealth, Julian couldn't argue with that. No one could. If you believe in fairness, you believe in that.
That's exactly right. And I think there is no place for class warfare in Australian society, and I think these comments have kind of been overblown a bit.
Her comments have been overblown a bit. She repeated them over and over again. That's the reason that we're all talking about.
I think the reaction to them, and I think I'm a proud South Sydney supporter, and I and anyone else that follows the NRL knows that you go for two teams, your own team and whoever's playing Manly, and that's a bit of light-hearted, competitive sort of game playing. We don't have a class warfare taking place in Sydney. We don't. These are kind of light-hearted jibes, and maybe it was inappropriate.
We wouldn't have one if she understood the demography of Sydney. I mean, the reality is that where Tony Abbott lives is not quite as elite as Julia Gillard clearly thinks.
Absolutely.
And even if it was, it's probably not appropriate for a leader to be all about the concept of the other. I mean, Tony Abbott gets accused of being all about the concept of the other, including by yours truly in relation to asylum seekers. But Julia Gillard has tried to turn this into a class war issue. I don't accept that she's just playing polite games. She had 3 or 4 opportunities when quizzed by the media in the last few days to recalibrate her message, and if anything, she strengthened it.
Well, I think it's unfortunate.
We've had a tale of two leaders this week. We've had Gillard playing a class war game, trying to sort of push Australians into two separate categories. We've had Tony Abbott, on the other hand, quoting from Ben Chifley, reaching out across the Labor aisle to traditional Labor voters, trying to unite the country. And I think it's really, really interesting, and I think it almost illustrates very well a tale of two different political parties and the fortunes that they face at the moment.
Julian, how is Tony Abbott, by opposing the mining tax?
A desperate government has decided to resort to this class warfare.
But Tony Abbott opposes the mining tax. This is a major redistribution, whether you agree with it or not, but you can't argue that...
Originally the mining tax was advocated because it was about addressing the two-speed economy, and the cuts in company tax were therefore calibrated against it, but then that got dumped with cash being thrown in the hands of middle and lower income earners. So the original reason behind the mining tax was to address the two-speed economy. Now it just seems to be to take from the miners to give to average voters, which may work in the polls, I don't know.
But one thing it isn't is what you just described, a major redistribution. The original version would have been, the numbers of the current mining tax are so...
Well, it's like the Alcopops tax. Yeah. It's pitiful numbers
relatively
insignificant to what they could have done.
And miners are saying, actually, the government's being aggressive with its forecasts. So I think one of the tragedies of this week is we've had a government that quite rightly went about reform, engaged Ken Henry in a tax review process that took for almost ever. But he came up with so many, hundreds of proposals, one of which, two that they adopted, the mining tax, they completely diluted, and they've now walked away from the reduction of company tax. Gonski did the same thing. We've heard nothing about any of his recommendations this week. It strikes me as bizarre that we've had a government try so hard to engage people to help with reform and then walk away from reform when it's mattered. I think it's been a pretty disappointing week for Labor politicians.
But it's been, I think, more broadly just the way in which they have gone about reform generally. You commission a report, you get independent people in, and then you kind of ignore it. I think if you're going to get people in to do a report, to consider a policy area, you need to have some sense of where you're going to go, and you need to back yourself. And I think the way in which... this government's been a study in how not to do reform, and the way in which you go about it...
I think the point is, and I don't disagree with Greg's comments, and there's a lot of great recommendations in the Henry Tax Review. The McKell Institute's actually come out and backed a range of them, including scrapping stamp duty and getting rid of negative gearing. But the point is, we've got a hung parliament, and we have to always remember that it is very difficult to get big reforms through. We've seen that.
What do you do for state government revenue if you scrap stamp duty and get rid of negative gearing?
You introduce land taxes, and that was actually a recommendation we made. And this is actually an interesting point out of the budget that hasn't had much attention, the dropping GST revenues. And as New South Wales residents, I'm actually feeling quite sorry for Mike Baird, who's staring down the barrel of $5 billion over the next 4 years in drops in GST revenues. And one of the ways that we feel sorry
for Christian Porter over in WA, where Western Australia's getting shafted on its share of GST revenue, courtesy of the car vote.
But the dropping GST revenue is real, and one of the ways that state governments can have a more sustainable base is by moving away from kind of cyclical taxes.
But it's hard for them to do that when they have constant tying of funding, like, for example, in this National Disability Support Scheme. Now, the Productivity Commission recommended that this be funded entirely by the Commonwealth. We've now got a situation where the Commonwealth is trying to make it a 50-50 funding arrangement without telling the states how much money is going to need to go into it. We know it's billions, and we know that state governments don't have the funds.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why if state governments move to land tax, then they'll have a stronger revenue base that will be consistent. So
the government has to be very careful in terms of managing expectations on that issue as well, Pete. People with disabilities are being told that a solution is next to nigh, and that message is getting out there without any consultation between the federal government and the states.
Shameless plug, I've written my column in The Australian tomorrow on exactly this issue, and whilst I am without doubt a fan of the concept of a national disability insurance scheme, the way that this has been pursued is an absolute disgrace, giving hope to some of the most vulnerable people in our community right at a time where, at absolute best, if everything goes according to plan and the numbers and the detail has not been put together in a way to make this happen, if everything goes according to plan, they are years and years away before people with a disability are going to receive the sort of funding that they need. But the government, for its base political advantage, is desperately trying to make out like it's delivered something that is a long way off being delivered. They should be ashamed about it.
We've seen this time and again from different promises from the government. Tony Abbott mentioned in his budget reply speech the Pacific Highway upgrade. The previous New South Wales government and the federal government had a deal that it'd be 50-50 split. Now they've decided, to be 80-20 split, 80% federal, 20% state. Now they're doing 50-50
Julian, that's one right. This is much more serious than that. I haven't heard anyone say that before. I'd be interested to read the article, but it struck me that the government needs to be very careful about the message it's sending to people with disabilities. It hasn't even sat down with the states, and it's carrying on like this is a fait accompli and it's about to be imposed.
All right, we're almost out of time. We've got just over a minute left. Peter, quick question. Wayne Swan, do you think that he'll be in the role to deliver the budget this time next year?
I do. And I think it'll be a surplus. So.
You shave your head if it's not a surplus?
I will. I'll come back home and shave my head.
All right, done. Well, one of us is going to lose one way or the other. Greg O'Mahony, what are your thoughts? Where are we going? Has the surplus, perhaps, or the potential of a surplus, done enough to stave off leadership talk?
I don't think so. And I think unless the polls bounce soon, we'll be hearing a lot more of what you said off air last week, which is maybe Kevin Rudd within months.
Julian, Lisa, final question for you. Do you think that you'll come back next week and not use Liberal talking notes?
Peter, I never use Liberal talking notes. I know this is a terrible slur against me that you say every week. It might interest you to know that people join a political party and they have similar views to other people in that political party too.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that the mob does think as one. All right, we are right out of time on Contrarians. Julian, Lisa, Greg O'Mahony and Peter Bentley for the first time. Thanks all very much for your company. And thank you for your company as well. Be sure and tune in to Australian Agenda on Sunday. We will have as our main guest the finance spokeswoman Penny Wong and also Tony Windsor, that crucial independent that's going to prop up the government as long as he stays with Julia Gillard. You're watching Contrarians. See you next week.